So, if you listen to our podcast, The Click Down, you know that last year I decided to move mid pandemic, which was crazy. And while moving can be super exciting, it can also be painful. It requires a lot of planning and time. You need to figure out, like, what do I need to bring over? What do I throw away? What have I accumulated over the years that I don't even know how it got there? And I think the same can be said when customers are thinking of moving from their traditional on-prem environment, which they may have had for several years. It may have been set up by someone else. And when they're making that move to the cloud.
Yeah, and we're bringing in one of our expert consultants she's had quite a bit of experience helping different organizations do this whole cloud migration. And what we want to do is provide, additional tips on when you make this transition on your own, how you can do it to be more successful. How can you make this whole transition to be even easier? So that's why we brought in Sarah Steinhoff to tell us what she knows and some of the tips and tricks that she's had with helping other organizations make this move. So welcome, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
So can you start and just kind of give us this overview of how you guide organizations through this whole migration process?
Sure. So I think at a very high level, when thinking about transitioning from an on-prem traditional CVAD architecture to CVAD service, we'd like to start with thinking about it as being very similar to migrations that those customers may have had in the past when moving between major CVAD releases, something more than just an in-place upgrade that would have required a completely parallel build, because it really does follow a lot of the same steps. Of course, the devil's in the details, as we'll get into a little bit more, but overall, first we need to define what the landing place is going to look like, right? So defining how many CVAD service tenants we need, how many zones we need, kind of map out where we're going to, what that destination looks like. We need to think about, from a user perspective, how we're getting them from point A to point B. So are we building out a new access tier? Obviously, with Citrix Cloud, there's also workspace and gateway services that we have to consider. Then once we have that new kind of destination mapped out in terms of components, we also have to get the settings from point A to point B. So how do we get the settings out of our current site and pulled into Citrix Cloud CVAD service? Once we have that all configured and users onboarded, we then have to make sure that we integrate those new components in with our existing monitoring tools. So we look at what kind of monitoring and alerting is available with Citrix Cloud and CVAD service. And then, of course, post-go live, we have to consider patching and maintaining. And of course, that's a little bit different when you talk about Citrix Cloud, where a good chunk of the environment is hosted and managed by Citrix, but there's still pieces that are owned and operated by the customer that they have to consider. So by and large, it should follow, like all those steps should look familiar from previous migrations. There's just going to be some details that are different when we look at cloud services. So kind of starting with that first step of defining that destination site. The majority of the time, so 9 times out of 10, customers are going to have a single CVAD service tenant, which would be the equivalent of a site, and just multiple zones and resource locations within it. However, this is not, an unlimited service. There are limits that Citrix has tested within a given CVAD service. So certainly, especially for large enterprise customers, you always recommend that they take a look at what those limits are. And if they have to exceed any of those limits, then they may need to consider multiple CVAD service tenants. The other key thing is that I would recommend against screenshotting this slide because these limits are always changing. So one key example I'd like to call out is the concurrent end users at the beginning of 2020 was sitting at 25,000. It's now at 100,000. So obviously some of these things are moving targets that you'll have to monitor over time. But if you already know that you're well above the number of resource locations that is supported tenant-wide, or the number of host connections, right? Then you can get ahead of some of that planning of knowing that you're going to have to split your CVAD service tenants into multiples to make sure that you're staying below these documented and tested limits.
Are there other reasons why an organization would want to have a multi-service approach besides hitting these maximum levels?
Sure. Another kind of common one, which we would also see on-prem, is if customers want a completely isolated kind of dev test environment where they can test other configurations or settings that may be isolated from their production instance. In that case, they could carve out a small number of licenses for a separate dev test environment. Another common one would be if there's any kind of data sovereignty reasons that, the actual CVAD site itself needs to reside within a specific geo. So you may have one where you have CVAD service hosted in the US, but for another subset of your users, maybe that has to be hosted in another geo based on the security requirements of that use case. But generally speaking, most of the customers that I work with, you can get away with that single CVAD service instance. And certainly there's advantages to doing that in terms of that consolidated administration and management, that you now have that one master studio console where you can manage all of your different environments. So as much as possible, we encourage consolidating, but certainly there's valid reasons why customers have multiple CVAD service instances.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that we're talking about the administrative component, right? The customers can still have multiple resource locations on-prem, in cloud, and multiple clouds, even with one single CVAD service.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key advantages of CVAD service too, is that, certainly on-prem, there were many reasons in terms of geographic distance or multi-domain where you had to have multiple sites, and the ability to consolidate those and collapse those into a single management infrastructure with cloud can really help simplify things with CVAD service, but it does require some more planning. So moving into kind of how we actually deal with the users, getting them from the current environment and moved up to Citrix Cloud. One of the key decision points that we have with Citrix Cloud is whether we continue to use more cloud services, so namely gateway and workspace services, replacing that on-prem storefront and gateway, in which case the architecture looks similar to what's kind of on the left side of the screen. Or if a customer chooses to just move those management components, so use the CVAD service, but together with an existing gateway and storefront, kind of maintaining that familiar user access flow into this new management platform. And there's usually kind of 3 key criteria that we tend to walk customers through for making that decision. First and foremost is resiliency. There's obviously been a lot of talk on blogs and online about service continuity with workspace service, bridging the gap to local host cache, which is available now. So obviously customers need to determine which of those options between service continuity or using local host cache with storefront best meets their resiliency requirements and needs. Another factor would be authentication methods. There's currently different authentication methods supported in workspace and gateway services compared to what you can get with on-prem gateway and storefront. So you need to make sure that whatever authentication method you want to enable for your users is available with the access tier that you choose. And then lastly, service integration, meaning which types of resources do you want to be able to be available to your users post-logon. So certainly storefront, purpose-built for virtual apps and desktops, so then it can integrate with an on-prem CVAD environment or Citrix Cloud CVAD service, but that's really it. It's only going to show you your virtual apps and desktops. If you want to show SaaS applications or integrate files with content collaboration or show micro apps, all of that really comes with Workspace Service, which as a native cloud service can integrate with a much broader spectrum of cloud services. So depending which of those best meets the needs of the users that you're targeting in this migration, that may drive you towards one access tier or another. So at this point, if you've determined, how many CVAD service sites you need and then what other access tier components you're going to deploy alongside CVAD service, we usually can move into actually getting the settings out of your on-prem CVAD sites and into CVAD service. And a key tool that we see that helps with this is the automated configuration tool. This is released and supported by Citrix. I know there's been a lot of community developed tools out there over the years, but we're strongly recommending the automated configuration tool as something that's being actively maintained and updated by Citrix. The intent of the automated configuration tool is that it exports all of the settings from one or more CVAD sites, and then you can import either all or pieces of those configurations up into your CVAD service. It also allows for export and import between CVAD service tenants. So going back to that first step, if you ultimately determine that you needed to have multiple CVAD service tenants, the automated configuration tool can help you keep those various tenants in sync by exporting and importing configurations across all of those tenants. Because it can be run multiple times, we often recommend that you do this in phases. So maybe you start with one test machine catalog and delivery group, and then run it again to do the next catalog and delivery group, and so on. It isn't just a one-time thing that you do to export everything and pull it all in. So you can certainly do this in phases and or across sites. So if you export and import across multiple on-prem sites, you can choose how you map those various sites into zones within the service. The only key caveat here that I will call out is that, of course, the order that you do this in matters, meaning if you have policies, for example, that are bound to delivery groups, obviously the delivery group needs to exist in the service before you import the policy that references that delivery group. So just kind of keep in mind how all of the various components may map and depend on each other before you run the import. But it really is helpful in saving you time in terms of things like republishing, hundreds of applications that you may have assigned on-prem, or redoing all those policies that you previously configured.
Yeah, and one of the, you were mentioning that there's, in the past, there's been a lot of different migration tools that are out there. And I think one of the points is, we don't call this the migration tools, is like you were saying, you can run this multiple times, and there's the option there to compare. And I don't know how many times you see issues in somebody's environment. It's like, hey, this isn't working the same way it worked yesterday because somebody made a change to the environment. Well, what's nice is you can run these compares just to, get a look at the environment. It's like, all right, what changed today from like a week ago? And helps you just to get back to troubleshooting, trying to figure out what somebody did to the environment.
Yeah, and even I think using it, right now we're in the context of migrating, but certainly even post go live, right? Because it can work within Citrix Cloud. This can also be a great kind of backup and restore tool where you can take an export of your CVAD service environment, and that can be your, like known good baseline working state. If there's a change or something happens, you can always restore from that backup. So that's certainly something that we think can be incorporated into your ongoing maintenance of the environment, not just to get settings from your existing into your new Citrix Cloud environment. And certainly keeping multiple tenants in sync has been something we heard of a lot from enterprise customers, even on-prem. So I think it's great that we now have that ability within Citrix Cloud. So another factor, of course, when planning out migrations is how are we going to monitor this environment on an ongoing basis. So within Citrix Cloud, there's various tiers at which we can do monitoring and alerting. So starting at kind of the top tier, within status.cloud.com, you can subscribe to alerts from various services across various geos. So certainly if you want to be aware of a service-wide or kind of platform-wide issue, we'd recommend subscribing to notifications through the status.cloud.com for the specific services that you are going to be subscribed to and using. So that way, if there's something that's impacting, multiple customers, not just you would be alerted to that issue as well as updates and resolutions to that issue. In terms of issues specific to a tenant that you may have within your administrator account settings, you can subscribe to errors through informational alerts. So again, if there's something that is specifically impacting one service instance and not necessarily a platform-wide issue, you can monitor it at that level. And then our good old friend Director. So that's the same email-based alerting that you've had on-prem. You can also do through your CVAD service. So you can set up the same delivery group alerts, load evaluation, session disconnects, all those kind of session-specific and CVAD service-specific alerts you can still get through CVAD service. And that can all also be done email-based. So kind of various tiers there from all services down to the specific CVAD service that you are monitoring. So should all look fairly familiar. And the last item here, kind of specific to alerting and kind of maintaining this environment, is Obviously, anything that is maintained within Citrix Cloud Service is the responsibility of Citrix, but we do have this new component where we have joint ownership, which can be a little bit funky, which is the cloud connector. So this is a component where the actual server itself, so the uptime of that VM, the Windows OS, patching of that server, and the software that runs on it is the responsibility of the customer, but there's one piece of software that's special, which is the Citrix Cloud Connector software on that machine that is patched and maintained by Citrix. So there has to be some kind of compromise here in that there's software on it that's going to be automatically updated by an external vendor, being Citrix, but also this Windows server that's the customer's responsibility to stay up and available. So the kind of middle ground there that we always recommend the customers configure is that it's possible to configure a preferred day of week and preferred time of day for those updates to be pushed down. So opposed to being deployed, when they're available, you can define a maintenance window that would align with, low usage of the environment so that Citrix will make sure that those updates are deployed at a time that is least likely to cause disruption to end users. And of course, those updates are then pushed kind of one at a time. So if we run into an issue on one server, we don't proceed with that upgrade. But certainly all the other components of the environment, I think it's a much clearer line, right, of ownership of storefront, for example, fully owned and operated by the customer, responsible for maintaining the Citrix software as well as anything about that Windows OS. Cloud connectors are just a little bit different and new when it comes to cloud, that you have to account for this piece of software that's being patched and maintained somewhat separately from everything else.
Is the update window for the cloud connectors, is that based on per cloud connector instance, or does that come down to like per resource location?
It's per resource location. So if you have resource locations in different time zones, you can set them, for that local time zone, but it would, whatever schedule you define would apply to all connectors within that resource location.
And that is one of the main reasons why we recommend at least 2 cloud connectors per resource location, right?
Yeah, and usually we'll even go up to 3. That way you can lose one, or one can be put effectively in maintenance mode from an update, and you would still have 2 that are HA for that given resource location. And that about wraps it up for kind of our migration. So again, thinking through defining what our target environment is going to look like in terms of number of CVAD service tenants and our target access tier, whether we're using existing gateway and storefront or workspace and gateway services, configuring those services, so using the automated configuration tool to export the settings from on-prem into cloud, and then maintaining that on an ongoing basis, and then making sure that we've integrated this new environment into our existing monitoring and alerting tools and considered new things like these cloud connector maintenance schedules to make sure that this new platform that we've rolled out is now patched and maintained appropriately.
And Sarah, in your experience, I know it probably varies customer by customer, but how long does this process take? Like, is it like a couple weeks? Is it months for them to get from, being a on-prem customer to fully migrated to the cloud?
I think certainly for existing deployed CVAD customers, because something is already rolled out, if you aren't changing anything about the VDAs, so for example, if you aren't coupling this with a migration to Azure for your VDAs or a VDA upgrade or anything like that, I've seen this done in a weekend. Because all you're doing, if you have everything staged, is repointing that VDA from a delivery controller to a cloud connector. And if all your settings are already migrated and you're not touching anything else, it can be a very simple move. More often, I see customers couple this change with other changes as well to the platform, like moving from 7.15 to 19.12, or considering a new public cloud location for those VDAs, in which case that can take weeks to slowly move your users over to that new VDA. But usually it's the VDA workload that takes the time. The actual move from CVAD to cloud, if that is all that you're doing and it's just that management plane change, can be done very, very quickly.
That's good to hear, and unfortunately we are out of time, which I wish we had more, because I bet you have a lot more tips and tricks for us. But with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us again.
All right, thanks for having me.